Thank you, Tendai. Thomas Sankara, born Thomas Isidore Noel Sankara, was born on the 21st of December 1949. And as you know, his parents, who were Catholic, wanted him to join the priesthood, as you have said, but instead he preferred joining the military. So at the age of 20, 1970, he joined the military of the then French Upper Volta, as the country was called. He was sent to military training in Madagascar, and whilst in Madagascar, he witnessed the popular student uprising, student and workers uprising that toppled the then Malagasy regime. And this shaped part of his thinking. Then he went to France, where he trained on parachute landing. And in France, he encountered revolutionary Marxist thought and began, I think, part of his political consciousness in Marxist, Leninist philosophies, as well as he encountered the negritude movement, and this shaped his Pan-Africanist ideals. And in understanding this, you then understand that this is a country where the literacy rates were very low in 1980s, early 80s, and they remain significantly low. Burkina Faso's literacy rate is presently 41.2%. It was below 16%, in fact, actually below 12%. And the country is ranked, if you take today's Human Development Index, 185 out of 189. So the preponderant challenges of poverty, of inequality, of desertification, and of course the usual predatory interest of France and some of the neighboring countries within the Sahel was such that Burkina Faso was a country that experienced both endemic poverty and the contradictions of post-colonial government. And so Sankara, who had trained as I said, in Madagascar and a bit of France, was sent in 1974 to fight in that pernicious border war with Mali. And he became a hero in that 1974 border war with Mali. Although later on, as you know, he renounced the war as useless and unjust. He returns from that war, obviously a popular figure, a mythical hero, and the country is hit, as I've said, in the 1980s with labor union strikes and military coups. And having come back home with these outstanding military achievements and charismatic leadership, Sankara became almost a preferred, a poster child of political appointments by successive regimes. But Sankara's own personal and political integrity was such that he would, I think, almost inevitably clash with his superiors, especially the military rulers who were appointing him and felt they needed him. So one of the most interesting things is that there was a coup that brought a council, what was called the Council for the Salvation of the People, in January 1983, which was led by Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo. Ouédraogo's Council for the Salvation of the People appointed Sankara as prime minister. And it is in this role that Sankara met the international leaders, especially of the Marxist, Leninist leaning countries, such as the Cuban Fidel Castro, Mozambique's Samora Machel, and Maurice Bishop of Granada, amongst many others. And his distinct political stance with regard to relationship with the outside world was, of course, anti-imperialist. But his internal approach to relating with the Burkinabe people was grassroots populism or popularity of sorts. And this brought him into conflict with his superior, Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo. And so he was removed as prime minister in May of 1983 and immediately arrested. And it's interesting that his life is full of contradictions. On the 4th of August, Blaise Compaoré, who was his longtime friend and comrade, led a group of military officers to free Sankara. So they overthrew Jean-Baptiste Ouédraogo and formed what was called the National Council of the Revolution, which was headed by Thomas Sankara. And it's important to note this because when Compaoré will later feature in this conversation for overthrowing Sankara, and also for being overthrown by a popular uprising in 2014. And in thinking about Thomas, there are many faces and phases to Thomas Sankara. And when you're thinking about the faces and phases to Thomas Sankara, you need to think about the politics of the 1980s. We are in the, if you like, in the vortex of the Cold War, where there is fierce fighting and battle to control the rest of the world between the West and the East, led by the Soviets and the Chinese, and the West led by America, Britain, France, and Germany. So it is in these circumstances that Sankara becomes president of Burkina Faso. And the country was at the time called Upper Volta, as you know. Amongst other things, Sankara, upon assumption of power, declares what is called the objectives of the democratic and popular revolution, which were, in summary, eradication of poverty, eradication of corruption, fighting environmental degradation, empowering women, increasing access to education and healthcare. So, and overall, I think his agenda was what he saw as liquidating imperial domination, not just in Burkina Faso, but in the whole of Africa and the rest of the world. So if you think about the policies that Sankara was pursuing, which was this preventing famine, and the means that he employed, which is agrarian and self-sufficiency and land reform, or his prioritization of education through that nationwide literacy campaign, or the promotion of public health by an ambitious program to vaccinate more than 2 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles. I think you need to remember, though, that at the time, between 18,000 and 50,000 children in Burkina Faso were dying per annum of measles and meningitis. And so the ambition to vaccinate 2 million people, 2 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles was in order to eradicate what he saw as the health scourge. The other thing was Sankara built schools, health centers, water reservoirs, and nearly 100 kilometers of rail, just in those 4 years that he was in power. And he did so with little or no external aid. And because of the policies he adopted, the total cereal production of Burkina Faso rose by 75% between 1983 and 1986. And his ambitious program to combat desertification led to the planting of 10 million trees. And of course, you know that in the agrarian reform program, he redistributed land from private landowners. He suspended rural poll taxes and domestic rents. And this program, perhaps these programs got very popular approval from the ordinary Burkinabe, but alienated certain sections, and I'll come to what sections of the population were alienated by them. And as I said, when he started this ambitious road and railway construction program, and called on every village to build a medical dispensary, and modeled around the Cuban Revolution. And he built, in that short space of time, pharmacies, about 5,384 out of 7,500 villages. That's more than what the Zimbabwean government or the South African government has been able to do in the duration that the two countries have been liberated. So if one looks at whether or not these programs were successful, from 1982 to 1984, the infant mortality rate in Burkina Faso dropped from 2008 per 1,000 births to 145. School attendance increased from 6% to 22%. And Sankara's government outlawed female genital mutilation. They outlawed forced marriages, and they outlawed polygamy as well. Sankara took in pursuit of something that Samora Machel had done, took the audacious step of appointing women to high government positions. He encouraged women to work outside the home and to stay in school even if pregnant. So when you are reflecting on this, you might ask, how did he manage to achieve this within a period of 4 years? And what might have been the fallout from such an ambitious program? Sankara put in place committees for the defense of the revolution, taken after the Cuban-style revolution, and these were responsible for the prosecution of corrupt public officials. They also sought to prosecute people who were deemed to be counter-revolutionaries and lazy workers. These prosecutions were done through popular revolutionary tribunals. In essence, colleagues, what Sankara had done was similar to what Nyerere had done, similar to what Samora had done, similar to what Mugabe attempted in Zimbabwe in the first 10 years of independence. It was to adopt a Leninist approach that saw dissent as luxury and the business of the state and the Revolutionary Vanguard Party as that of defending the revolution and building both social and economic progress towards some form of self-reliant growth. As a result, Sankara banned opposition political parties, constrained the activities of trade unions in order to restrain what had become incessant wildcat strikes in Burkina Faso. And this was the same in all our countries in the 1980s, as I said, because of the global economic crises and the Third World debt crisis. He curtailed press freedoms and fired striking teachers, sometimes replacing them with younger people who did not necessarily have the experience. These drastic measures that he saw as necessary for the defense of the revolution obviously alienated Burkinabe middle class. His removal of the privileges that the traditional leaders had of forced labor and tribute payments essentially created a very hostile class amongst the traditional chiefs against his rulership. And because of his anti-imperialist stance, he alienated the more conservative forces within Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso society, as well as the French, who saw most former colonies as their property. A lot of people make reference to what Sankara said. What Sankara said is important. What Sankara did is more important. Most people only reference Sankara's fight against corruption within the ruling party and amongst the ruling elite in Burkina Faso, and in particular Sankara's removal of the privileges that the ruling elite had in terms of vehicles and other such things. What most people forget, and which is what I think this conversation ought to reflect on, is Sankara's notion of democratic and popular revolution was the repurposing of the Burkinabe state in order to achieve the three objectives of developmentalism, which was to align economic and social policy for the upliftment of the general welfare of the people, but to do so on the basis of a socialist, if you like, a Marxist ideology, which was minimize predation within the economy and private ownership, and hence the land reforms. Take a fairly pernicious approach to dealing with elite capture, elite corruption, as well as wastage in government and laziness. And this often meant that the actions taken by the state fell foul of traditional liberal notions of rule of law and rule of rights. And the reference of matters to popular tribunal was often seen as against the rule of law concept. But Sankara's audacious actions to empower women within the public and private space were without equal or parallel in his time. Samora Machel had articulated and sought to do something similar in Mozambique, but no one had gone the step or the direction that Sankara went to. And Sankara's investment in education and healthcare is something I think that will resonate with the crisis that Africa currently faces, which is disinvestment in the rural economy, disinvestment in our ecology and environment, disinvestment in education and healthcare. In essence, disinvestment in social policy, where we've then ended up with growth in economy, GDP growth, but no similar growth in the quality of lives of the people. Sankara was not just a revolutionary. Sankara was a visionary. So Sankara began to set Burkina Faso on a path towards industrialization, and industrialization based on the construction or building of local economies. And part of what he did, he understood that local economies, so if you read his political philosophy and practice, he understood that the local economies required human capital development or human skills development. Hence, the emphasis was not just on literacy, but on the growth of certain skills. He understood that in order to sustain this revolution, you needed international solidarity, hence his relationship with similar-minded governments across the then so-called Third World. But Sankara also understood that the role of the West or imperial forces was not necessarily benign. It was not intended to assist former colonies. And his position on being anti-imperial was viewed by some at the time as unwise, but never questioned on the basis of principle. I think that everybody understood that what the West was doing was undermining the ability of Africa to transition from dependent economies into self-reliant growth. And also Sankara's basic posture was to appreciate that what needed to happen for Africa to develop was to have alternatives other than the one dominant paradigm that the West was offering. In sum, Sankara understood that in order to achieve the sort of transformation and changes that he envisaged for his country and for Africa, it took a certain degree of madness, of non-conformity. That meant not conforming with the neoliberal dogma which was emerging at the time, not conforming with the debt alcoholism that many countries around him were engaged in, borrowing, almost binge borrowing from the West, and therefore tethering their economy's fortunes to those of their former imperial masters. But you also understood that you needed to address the work ethic and culture amongst your own citizens, hence the reference to lazy workers, to wastefulness in government, to corruption within the elite. And these approaches speak to great intentions, but also great risks. And these risks are what led to the coup that removed him in office. The approach he took, which was an investment that focused largely on addressing the social and ecological factors that threatened the very basis of growth in Burkina Faso, and his stance not to rely on external debt in the context of the Cold War, and his reduction of certain activities within the economy essentially meant that a collusion between external and internal forces of production led to economic challenges for Burkina Faso. The levels of social investment without perhaps as much or rapid economic growth essentially meant that the country faced a budget deficit of sorts. And then, of course, there was huge opposition to his social policies in certain quarters that had predatory elites that had been used to exploiting the poor. And with the assistance of the French and other forces, this led to loss of support in popular support in certain quarters. But because he led a government of elites who did not necessarily share his ideology, or if they did not share his level of personal and political integrity, internal feuds emerged within the governing council or the ruling elite. And that's what led his comrade who had freed him from prison to become his murderer barely 4 years later. The fundamental lessons we get from the successes of Sankara that I've relayed in preventing famine through a clear program of agrarian self-sufficiency and land reform, of prioritizing education through a nationwide literacy campaign, of promoting public health by vaccinating more than 2 million children against meningitis, yellow fever, and measles, of building schools, healthcare centers, water reservoir, and nearly 100 kilometers of rail and quite a bit of road without or with little external aid, of raising total cereal production by 75% between 1983 and 1986, of planting 10 million trees to combat desertification, of redistribution land to ensure greater productivity within the rural economy, of suspending rural poll taxes and domestic rents, and of starting the ambitious public works program. What it teaches us is that all things are possible through leadership, will, and commitment, clear vision, clear policies, as well as, I think, the commitment to action, to execution, and, if you like, an obsession with ensuring that results are achieved. But what it also teaches us is that no leader is able to take a country from point A to point B without a clear set of politics that drives their programs. If a leader panders consistently to external stimuli or interest other than the interest of their own people, such a leader is unable to achieve what we see Sankara did in just 4 years. So part of the underdevelopment that we experience across the continent must be critiqued in the face of what we now know, that you had a young leader who didn't have fancy years spent in foreign schools or in long years spent in government, who through sheer will and vision, grit, was able to do a great deal for his people. We learn too that doing good for your people does not prevent those forces that benefit from chaos and underdevelopment within your own country, and those forces that are based in former imperial centers or external forces may collude to eliminate any leadership that wishes to achieve genuine development. And that therefore progressive forces in any country or moment must align and must do so for the defense of that which they believe to be of strategic national interest. We learn too, though, that sometimes great leadership is dogged or enveloped or shadowed or overshadowed by controversy. So for many of us who believe and celebrate Sankara's revolutionary ideals, his commitment, his integrity, we cannot shy away from paying attention to some of the illiberal behavior that led to the restraint of what we now call civic and democratic space. And this raises the big question on whether or not development necessarily requires undermining of those civil liberties. Or is it possible in a modern society to actually achieve both? A measure of civil liberty attended by, if you like, revolutionary clarity, enforcement of the laws, eradication of corruption, eradication of poverty, creation of local economies, and combating the predatory activities of both foreign and domestic finance capital. Well, I think that we have a problem that arises from how we've been schooled. We've been schooled largely in a moment where liberal triumphalism has suggested to us that there's only one version of society, something akin to Francis Fukuyama's End of History, which version of society says you are either a liberal democracy or anything else does not work, or anything else is a sin, so to speak. And this is problematic. It's problematic because regime typology does not define democraticness of society. If democracy is about governance of the people, meaning people fully participate, co-create solutions to their challenges, as opposed to the Weberian sense that people get a small committee to preside over their affairs, we'll realize that the characterization of regimes hardly defines what we see. Its question should be, does society, within its economy, within its social policy, within its political practice and culture, within its environmental practice and culture, does society reflect and contain spaces for the effective participation and agency of citizens? That is separate from the liberal democracy notion of, are we voting, is the media free to criticize, and etc. And it seems to me that this is where the crux of the matter is. The crux of the matter is not benevolent dictatorship. It is not a liberal democracy that passes all the freedom indices. It is in the quality of economic, political, and social participation in society. And that is the definitive. And so regime typology, whilst important for some reasons, I think is not the most important thing. Because you can have free, fair, regular elections, and society is not sufficiently democratic in the sense that I've described. You can have a free press, and the inequities and inequalities in the economy are even deeper. So that's why we have countries, including countries on this continent, that are deemed democracies where the levels of poverty are scandalous. The levels of elite predation and corruption are scandalous. The levels of disenfranchisement of the poor are scandalous, but they're still called democracies. We've seen this in Western liberal democracies such as France itself, such as the United Kingdom and the United States. The levels of disenfranchisement of if you call African Americans, indigenous peoples, and the poor is scandalous. And yet these are called democracies because they have institutions within which elites are able to order their affairs, debate matters, and there's a seeming right for such poor people to complain about structures that would never change within their society. As a result of the Kagame reforms, the AU has shifted. Most of its operational budget is coming from member states. The previous position was 98% of the entire AU budget came from donors. The amount of the budget that comes from, programmatic budget that comes from donors is still very high. It's upward of 80%. And if you add to this what we call off-budget financing, which is donors who don't necessarily put the money through the AU accounting system, but arranged with AU departments or organs of the African Union to support specific programs, either through a direct execution program or some other such creative means. You would actually take that back into the 90s. So in just thinking about financing of SADC, financing of the East African Community, of SANSAD, of Maghreb Union, financing of ECOWAS is slightly different, because ECOWAS introduced an airline taxation program that significantly enabled them to finance most of their operational and programmatic budget. They still get some donor money. In essence, the challenge we have is African leaders that go to continental bodies, make loud, hair-raising speeches, declare big intentions about how to liberate Africa from colonialism, imperialism, and etc. And then they go cap in hand back to the former colonial powers, begging for money to support the development or the implementation of their plans. That's number one. The second problem we have is just one of fundamental disconnect between what the national centers, which is the policy-making organs of a state government, and the parliaments do, and what happens at the regional economic communities and at the African Union level. Sometimes the commitments made either by ambassadors, ministers of foreign affairs, by heads of state is not translated at all into national policy. If you want just to look at some of the most absurd consequences of this, is from 1963 to date, over 70% of the resolutions, declarations, and charters made were really never domesticated in most of our country context. Domestication of certain commitments has financial implications. It has implications for human resourcing. It has implications for how you structure government intervention in specific areas. There's a third element, that our governments have been unwilling to cede some measure of their sovereignty to enable the shared vision and shared values and shared agenda that they agreed to at a regional level to become operational. We're seeing a slight shift within the context of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, but that's driven largely by corporate interests and perceptions in certain quarters that this will bring some benefit. There are a lot of areas that need thorough thinking in terms of potential losses as a result of removal of tariffs, and also preparedness of domestic industries to compete in the broadened free trade area within the continent. Sankara's ghost indeed is haunting Blaise Compaoré. One would think that in almost 37 years after the assassination or murder of Sankara, that life had forgotten about this horrendous act of betrayal that Compaoré engaged in. His own leadership ended in the most unfortunate of circumstances. His trial for a murder that he committed in the 80s, that enabled him to ascend to power and keep a stranglehold on power till 2014, is a stark reminder to those in power across the continent, in whatever country, that the memory of those who are victims is never erased by the passage of time. That if anything, modern society remembers atrocities committed, and that immunities and impunities assumed will not always apply. The old thought that leaders would die in office is not guaranteed. Compaoré thought that he would die in office and therefore he would escape the long arm of the law, because he was the law in Burkina Faso. The popular uprising by the people and components of his own elite has landed him in a situation where what he felt was an assured life in power is now assured imprisonment for the many crimes of power. I think that when we look at the inspiration of that generation of leadership within the Marxist-Leninist school or socialist school. So be it Mugabe, be it Samora Moises Machel, be it Fidel Castro, be it Nyerere, be it what we saw in China actually with the Chinese leaders, all the way up to Xi Jinping, is what we saw in that generation was a commitment to a particular ideological position, which is the application of state resources to achieve collective development and the creation of egalitarian society. The experiments were heavy on the social investment and perhaps not as deft in terms of the balance between the social investment and economic policies, economic growth. So the understanding had been, or at least the approach, was that any form of private ownership led to privatization and therefore, if you like, exploitation, and that some form of state capitalism would lead to a counter to this sort of predation. But the assumption was that the state would have the capacity and the competency to drive economy, to drive economic growth, to drive distribution and redistribution within the economy. Obviously, where corruption, where incompetence, where selection of leadership is not entirely based on merit, where the public administration may not share the same values of the political leadership, this became difficult. But perhaps we all must have the courage to question whether wholesale shift either to neoliberal economic policies or to state capitalism or to socialism and Marxism, Marxist communist type economies would resolve contradictions of a hugely diverse economic sector and highly heterogeneous societies. It would seem to me that heterodox economic policies that combine a certain measure of social policy that guides and is also guided by economic policy achieve better balance in the sense that they achieve the social objectives of developing the human capital base, broadening the economic ownership base, and at the same time not constraining the capacity of the economy to grow, entrepreneurship, and the like. So I think that, yes, you can compare Sankara and Mugabe, the major difference being the levels and extent to which Sankara was willing to use his own life as a model of integrity, fighting corruption, including corruption within the ruling party or the ruling council that he presided over. And I think that this is also the distinguishing feature that we learned from the Chinese, the focus on fighting corruption not in government as an abstract body, but fighting corruption within the ruling party, because the ruling party, as you know, within those regimes that tended towards one-party state, the ruling party often saw the party as supreme to government. And as such, if the party is corrupted and lacks accountability, and there are no means and ways of holding the party elite to account, by extension, government would be corrupt, and accountability mechanisms would be compromised. I think that the issue is not simply whether the social expenditures were unchecked against economic growth rates. Within the context of the Cold War, there was a commitment by the West to discourage and to undermine any attempt at presenting socialism as an alternative. And herein lay the conundrum or the challenge for most African economies, those that were dependent on the export of raw materials, and in particular gold and other minerals. Most of their markets were in the West, and the West favored a capitalist system of economic growth. These countries adopted a socialist path of development, which was directly in antagonistic to the Western paradigm. So the West did everything in its power just to squeeze these economies in order to dissuade their leanings towards what they saw as the influence of China or of the Soviet Union. So the failure, yes, it may have been to ensure that both political and economic and social policy are aligned, and that none seems to unduly dominate the others, that there is a fair balance in political objectives, economic objectives, and social objectives. However, in the context of the Cold War, we may be overly simplistic in saying Ujamaa failed, the Bukanabe experience failed, and etc. I think what we have to keep in mind, and we now know from declassified CIA files as well as French intelligence and British intelligence files, that the West did not just sit and watch the growth of socialist tendencies within former colonies. It took active steps not only to undermine but also to eliminate the protagonists of such policies. And it took active steps to ensure that the economies were squeezed and that social insurrection arose from discontented publics in order to, if you like, prove a pre-held notion that socialism was inimical to the common good. And so we're all pawns in this game between the East and the West. And much of the failure of the alternatives is not a failure of the alternatives in their application, but an induced failure. I think that we face an interesting dilemma as Africans. If we follow the logic of your questioning, you will note that our governments, national governments, are largely funded by outsiders. So if one follows your logic that these institutions may well belong to the funding agents and therefore have no likelihood to serve the interest of Africans. So you'd say a foreign funded government in essence would belong to the funding agencies, whether they're international financial institutions or countries. That's at a national level, and you could cascade it down to the local level. And then you'd say a regional economic community, an African Union, a United Nations. We would land ourselves into a situation where no institution, local, national, regional, or global, could possibly ever serve our interests. Would you take us to a conversation on whether sheer funding by foreign actors suffices to undermine the capacity of an institution to serve our interests? We know that it is not absolutely so. We creatively used the United Nations space in fighting for decolonization. We creatively used the same space in declaring Rhodesia a pariah state and the apartheid regime in South Africa a pariah state. And the United Nations was still funded by the same retrograde imperial forces that it is. What happened was that the developing world, which had formed a consensus within the non-aligned movement post the Bandung conference, used its numbers within this fraught multilateral system in order to upend what it saw as an imperial agenda, or to use the power of voting as a block to push certain agenda. It is my common belief that the African Union cannot be better than the sum of its parts, which is, if governments at the national level are corrupted, if governments at the national level do not represent the interests of their people, if governments at the national level are repressive, if governments at the national level are not doing well in terms of policy, economic development, inclusive growth, and all the things that we aspire for, we are unlikely to have a body such as the African Union that is made up of these same governments achieving any better. However, there is across the continent and the world a sweeping tide of citizens that are fighting to redeem back their power, their agency, their right to determine what happens, of private sectors, of academics, of activists, of artists. I believe that as long as we stand back and give up on these institutions, they are unlikely to reform or to transform. That therefore, the way to go beyond this is to address the donors and their duplicity, because in their countries they supposedly or purport to promote democracy, freedom of will and action, and etc. So their ideals and their ideas are mismatched in their foreign policies and their relationship with African and other institutions. That's number one. Number two, I think citizens have a space through ECOSOC and other, mechanisms to engage the African Union and African Union organs and institutions. What we've generally found is that, especially in Southern Africa, citizens are disinterested in regional agenda. They are disinterested in internationalism, except those citizens who are entrepreneurs and those citizens who perhaps constitute a minority. This is actually a contradiction, because our history, the liberation for Zimbabwe was done with the active support of the Zambians, the Mozambicans, the Tanzanians, the Algerians, the Ethiopians, and others. That internationalism, Pan-African internationalism, black internationalism, was key to shaping what the institutions did. Don't forget, the OAU established the Liberation Committee that supported the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe. The same institution, which was funded still at the time by some foreign entities. So I would suggest that it is up to progressive forces within our societies, within the continent, within our regions, to take an active interest in the democratization, not just of national spaces, but of regional spaces, and in creating a form of constitutionalism and genuine Pan-Africanism at the national level and at the regional and continental level, a form of internationalism that has people at the center and not just foreign interests or interests of businesses. Frankly speaking, the non-aligned movement hasn't been as active. What has happened is that the leaders who shared the politics of non-alignment all have left power, retired, or died. The new leadership that we have, obviously, some of them are remnants from that era of leaders who had an ideological clarity, who had a clear position on how to engage the West, to engage imperialism and new imperialism, and how to engage in solidarities that made countries not to race to the bottom by competing against each other, but for countries to take collective positions that would lead to, better benefits for the collective South. And I think that there is still an unaligned movement, but it is not as robust. It has no champion. Gaddafi, who was the last champion of the non-aligned movement, of course, died in the circumstances that he did. And it is useful that in looking at the current pedigree or quality or caliber of African leaders, we ask ourselves, do they have a transformative internationalism? Do they have a radical internationalism, or they have a pragmatism that enables them to mollycoddle with the West as long as they think that their narrow strategic national self-interests have been served? I think the pandemic has presented African leaders with an opportunity to rethink the positioning of Africa within the broader global political economy, but to rethink the purpose and nature of African unity, collaboration, in ways that would enable Africa not to become a victim, as we have seen now with this vaccine apartheid and vaccine injustice. It is actually ironic that when the non-aligned movement arose, its leadership was not China. If you look at the conferences all the way up to the 80s, the leadership of the non-aligned movement was Nkrumah, Suharto in Indonesia, Nehru in India, and Fidel Castro. So, and there was, China was treated with suspicion when first it sought to engage within the context of the non-aligned movement. And after its embrace, China adopted a posture within the non-aligned movement where it avoided over-projecting itself, but saw itself as a counter-posing power to the then USSR, and in part, of course, I think that it's fair to say the collapse of the Soviet Union and also the rise of neoliberalism and Fukuyama's or Margaret Thatcher and Reagan's TINA, there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization, significantly weakened the non-aligned movement. As you know, post-1989, it took fairly interesting positions on critical things, including the end of apartheid in South Africa, the decolonization of Western Sahara, amongst other things. But it was most potent in its rebuke of the impacts and effects of the structural adjustment programs. But the consensus was collapsing because whilst structural adjustment program and the neoliberal type policies that they were promoting ultimately found hit, if you like, rocky shores, neoliberalism as a mental culture, as an intellectual posture, and etc., actually remained lodged in the thinking of governments, in the thinking of academics, in the thinking of civil society. So the non-aligned movement in an era where countries were dealing with a single global power, which was the United States at the time, post the Soviet moment, it seemed not a high priority. But I think that was a mistake, because as we see, the repolarization has led to the replacement of the non-aligned movement with the China-Africa, India-Africa, Brazil-Africa summit, Turkey-Africa, and etc. Yeah, the SADC has developed impressive policies or intentions. SADC had a collaboration with the Southern Africa Trust in developing what was called a poverty observatory, which was meant to radically depart from traditional practice and constitute a joint platform with civil society and other stakeholders in monitoring poverty and inequality in the region and taking corrective measures. SADC developed a comprehensive plan on industrialization, value addition, or beneficiation. SADC developed an impressive plan on youth that looked at economic and other forms of empowerment. The SADC organ on politics, defense, and security was meant to mark a new era of dealing with the security question. So in essence, I think the challenge we faced was these changes were not structural. These changes were changes to the approach of the mother body, SADC. And I would like to suggest that SADC is largely funded by foreign actors. National governments contribute very little to the programmatic budget of SADC. Even the operational budget of SADC is largely funded by donors. For the most part, the distinction between SADC and the other regional economic communities is that SADC, if you like, SADC is unlike the other. It's not truly an intergovernmental body. It's not. It doesn't have the sort of independent secretariat that's able to take certain decisive actions. So it's literally almost a note-taker for the most part for the heads of state, which is sad because historically, other than ECOWAS, SADC has a long history of collaborative work as frontline states and an early intention to develop an economic cooperation platform. This was the most industrialized region of the continent, but if we look at economic growth generally, this region lags behind its East and West African equivalents. This region also had, historically, was the only region until recently that had not that had not undergone military coups. So it was generally deemed to be post-apartheid one of the most stable regions. And the challenge is that we had stability, we had fairly advanced economies and infrastructure, but the political will of the leadership to create a truly independent, functional and powerful regional body where they are able to cede part of their sovereignty for purposes of achieving joint security, joint defense, for purposes of achieving greater freedom of movement for their citizens and greater economic integration, lags far behind the rest of the regions. And if you juxtapose this against the financing architecture and model of SADC, it's somewhat inexplicable because we have some of the leading universities, some of the leading intellectuals on regional integration, but we're struggling as a region. The projected growth of Africa to 1.3 billion to about 1.5 billion of a largely youthful population and one that's tech savvy poses a threat. First, I think that Europe's concern with African migration has nothing to do with the migration patterns. For the most part, as you know, the biggest out-migration is within Africa itself. It's intra-African migration. But the aging European population realizes that inward migration into Europe from Africa by a more youthful population will inevitably within a generation lead to an African majority because the fertility rates and population growth rates in Europe are low. African population growth rates are such that Africa could easily dominate a significant part of its former imperial powers. So I think you are very right in many respects. We've never quite, beyond the rhetorical, determined how best to harvest this potential, how best to harness this potential. And we've not thought through how to do so within our industrialization model, whether it's agrarian or extractive sector-based or it's services or technology-based. And this lack of clarity actually is what makes it problematic. I think that all studies and all evidence points to what you have referred to, an advantage. But an advantage without a plan becomes a huge disadvantage. In fact, this is part of what's feeding the discontent within our own continent. And I suspect that we need a leadership that actually understands what you have articulated, and not just understands, has a practical know-how and willingness to take practical steps to ensure that the growth of the population actually becomes an advantage, and how we relate with the rest of the world, and how we're able to deploy and become more globally competitive on our own terms. There's absolutely no reason why the AU should rely on external budgets. The Olusegun Obasanjo led a commission that made proposals for all AU member states to levy climate change tax on foreign flights coming to Africa. And it was a small amount, an additional 2%, because African airlines were paying carbon tax or levies when flying into other jurisdictions. This was not undermined by external players. It was African countries that gave the most nebulous reasons, suggesting that their tourism industries would be undermined by such a tax. The calculations that Obasanjo committee had done, that quite a number of experts, was that having such a tax on airlines, especially the big foreign airlines, would provide sufficient amount for Africa to finance the operations of the African Union. So I'm a strong believer that part of the financing challenges of the African Union, or the sheer dependence on external financiers, is a lack of vision, or a lack of self-confidence, or an inferiority complex. Whichever one chooses on that spectrum, it has the same consequences. That will get pittances from our former colonial powers, and in exchange we hand over our sovereignty. That we are unwilling to take just the one step, or bear any cost for our own transformation and the capacity to implement our own aspirations. And it's sad, it can only be a mindset problem. I mean, look, the levels of disinterest of citizens, and I think a critical number of citizens in our regional economic communities, is maybe related to the levels of disinterest of our citizens in national institutions, other than during the time of elections. It seems to me that there needs to grow a new consciousness that says these institutions are not owned by the political elite, that these institutions are actually financed in part by taxes paid by SADC citizens or African citizens, and that therefore they must represent the views and aspirations and legitimate expectations of African citizens. Until we adopt such a stance, I think that we're going to keep an arm's length relationship with these institutions, and the political elite are just going to use these institutions for purposes of posturing, and that's a tragedy of our moment. No matter how useless our institutions are, it is in our collective interest to repurpose them so that they serve our collective interest. You know, there are people who say, well, we don't need the state. Well, we have no other means in an international relations that are ordered through relationships among states to assert our interests. So the states, as imperfect as they are, these African multilateral institutions, as imperfect as they are, they de facto and de jure are our voice in the global multilateral system, and it is in our interest to make sure that they work, and they work in our interest, that they are financed from resources. The amount of money that African leaders steal and bank in tax havens or in the West would suffice to finance the operations of our regional institutions. Paul, I think that the Continental Free Trade Agreement will resolve part of the challenges that you identify if we effectively deal with tariff and non-tariff barriers. I mean, understandably, some of the agreements around trades and goods and services and the general agreements are still being concluded. If the AfCFTA becomes operational and standards and quality assurance questions are attended to, this will grant some reprieve, because there are goods that we don't trade with each other, but we trade with Europe, where the transportation cost, the determination of cost, and even where there's preferential market access, some of the challenges are enormous. Yeah, and I think we could actually increase our market share within our regions. At the moment, the levels of protectionism and just tariffs make it difficult for the smaller countries, for the smaller players to enter markets. Limitations on travel, on movement, whether visa-based or otherwise, are also inhibitive. Access to capital, including risk of venture capital for some of the small to medium enterprises, is a key issue. And then, of course, the production costs. I mean, look, our energy costs just in Zimbabwe are ridiculously high. So we've not structured our economies to compete. We've not structured them to benefit from, I think, the short-term trade that the region offers itself. And I think there's a long way to go. The issue is that our population growth could become, as we saw during COVID, we have a lot of creative, innovative young people, channeling and harnessing this and developing critical programs for the growth and development of skills. There's a lot that could happen to stimulate significant growth by increasing trade amongst ourselves or within the continent. But I think, look, we have to think long and hard, and there are certain downstream investments that need to be made, reorientations of our education, reorientations of our skills development programs, infrastructure, both micro and macro. There's a lot, I think, that we should and be able to do to change our dependence on Europe or even AGOA, the American sweetheart deal. And Zimbabwe in particular, I think, could phenomenally benefit from agriculture to manufacturing from this continental free trade agreement. I think what's happened is that China, and we're seeing the reinvention of the United Kingdom post-Brexit, and France are trying exactly what you are suggesting here. That is choosing particular African countries as entry points into the integrated African market that the Continental Free Trade Agreement is creating. Clearly for these countries, we're seeing a race to the bottom. They feel like they are the courtship by the East and the West means that they are somewhat special. But in essence, this is a new approach by capital, Western and Eastern capital. You choose a center that gives you a doorway into the rest of the region. You establish some forms of monopoly. And notably, we don't actually have anti-monopoly and competition laws that apply across our regions. And without these, I think that we're going to see quite some dramatic losses and fallouts with the opening up of our markets. And I think that this demands of us as professionals, finance experts, investment experts, lawyers, and etc., to begin to look at our competition laws, to begin to look at questions, certain fundamentals that we've previously opposed, whether a measure of protectionism within certain sectors and the economy would be merited as we enter into this much broadened AFCFTA approach, and whether we actually need a collective approach in how we deal with Chinese, European, American, and British investment, as well as other emerging powers that I think are hugely investing in our territory, Turkey, South Korea, and etc. And if you think about it, a country like Rwanda would have a gateway into the Great Lakes and and Kenya into the broader East Africa region, Ethiopia, same, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Nigeria into the rest of those markets, and of course Cameroon, Togo into Central Africa, and Tunisia, Egypt into Maghreb Union and West Asia. This is a genuine issue. It's a genuine concern, and much of it is dealt with at the level of policy. Part of it is dealt at the level of politics. A strategic approach to this instrumentalization of gateways is one that I think Asia went through. I think the Malaysian Mahathir's response to China regarding what China had done in Sri Lanka, and other complaints that were raised with respect to America's attempt to use Chile, Venezuela, and other countries within the Latin American and Caribbean regions for the same purposes. Has been noted in history, and how this led to trade wars. We have a lot of lessons from NAFTA. We have a lot of lessons from how trade arrangements and also gateway systems employed can be manipulated. Yeah.